Hello my sweet berries, welcome back to the channel. Today we are trying something new in our In the Shoes Series 2, Season 2, Series 1. I always mess up my intros for In the Shoes, I don't know why. To all new viewers, hi, I'm Belle. I'm a mess from hell. I don't know what the hell that was either. Today we're starting off as a mess. One thing before I start, my aunt's dog just died. I am grieving. I am very sensitive right now. So if I end up crying while narrating this case, please forgive whatever happens because of my emotional outburst. We are talking about a case that was never resolved, or rather, it was resolved, but no one was ever apprehended for the crime. That might be a conflicting statement with something I say further ahead, because the culprits were never arrested for the crime, but innocent civilians sure were. The Bloody Benders, everyone. We are in the United States between the years of 1871 and 1873. The state is Kansas, and we found ourselves around Labette County. The main participants are the four Benders, the four members of the Bender family. Well, so-called Benders, because there is conflicting evidence on what their real identities or names would actually be. We are going to continue referring to them as John Bender Sr., the father, Elvira Bender, the mother and wife, Kate Bender, daughter, John Bender Jr., the son. Now, referring to those four main characters, we'll call them, they're both the main characters and the villains in their own horror story. I say horror instead of thriller because there were over 11 victims, and I say over 11 because those were all the bodies they found. The bodies were only 11. However, the severed body parts, the bloodstains, the clothing, lots of extra evidence would suggest that over 20 victims were actually harmed and murdered by these psychopaths. It's one of the only ones I could find, if the only one, because at the time of recording this, I haven't searched up photos to add to the video yet. This photo is taken from the Benders in Kansas from 1913, so credit to that, it will be shown up here. Welcome to the Bloody Benders, America's first family of serial killers. They are now infinitely because they're dead, but also infamously remembered as legends, not in the good sense, however. The Benders story begins, like many from the same time period, thanks to the Homestead Act of 1862. After the Civil War, the Osage Indians were moved from their home in Labette County to Oklahoma in order to make the Kansas Territory available to European settlers. In October of 8 years later, in the year 1870, 5 families moved to this area of Osage, settling around 7 miles from where the city of Cherryville would be established. One of these families, you guessed it, was the Benders, who moved onto a 160-acre property facing the Osage Trail. The men, John Bender Sr. and Jr., were the first to arrive. Though thought to be German immigrants, the elder Bender was around the age of 60 and spoke little English with a thick accent, while the younger Bender, his son, was around 25. He spoke English quite well, but with an accent. However, it was a lot less prominent than that of his father. He had a habit of laughing aimlessly, and that same habit led him to be named a half-wit. After the men prepared the land with a cabin and a barn, the women arrived the next year. Elvira Bender, who went by Ma, was around the age of 55. She spoke little English and was so unfriendly that the neighbours dubbed her the She-Devil. Fitting, now that we know what she did. However, the star of this terrible family was unarguably Kate, an attractive 23-year-old who spoke English fluently and was a self-proclaimed healer and worked as a psychic who held seances with her senses. She claimed to cure illnesses and gave lectures on spiritualism. Though occultism wasn't necessarily unusual at the time, Kate's advocacy of free love, quote free love, because it's quite a controversial topic, and her particular notoriety, and drew fans to the Bender property. There, the family had used canvas to split the one-room cabin into two parts. The back was kept as living quarters, while the front was converted into a general store for dried herbs, I believe. Yes. There was also a kitchen and dining table in the front. The travellers who arrived there could stop for dry goods, but also a meal or even a night of rest. But Bender Inn wasn't the safe haven it proclaimed to be. It pretended to be this safe, innocent area for travellers to put their trust in. They could stay and enjoy themselves, but what lied ahead wasn't what they thought it was. The story that is going to unfold is one that would leave a local family with a nickname that remains infinitely infamous almost 150 years later. This is a story of the Bloody Benders, America's first family of serial killers. Let's begin. It would soon become the focus of an inquisition into a series of mysterious disappearances and deaths in the region. The bloodshed began on May 1871, when a man was found in Drum Creek, southeast of the Bender property, in what would become Montgomery County, with his skull crushed and his throat slashed. In February of next year, 2 more men were found with the same unique injuries. By the fall of that year, travellers had started to disappear off the Osage Trail. Reports of the murdered and disappearing people soon spread through the region, and travellers began avoiding the route due to all the missing reports. Meanwhile, vigilante groups tried, with little success however, to hold someone accountable, often arresting and then releasing innocent men who had nothing to do with the crime. But it was the appearance of George Newton Lonker, also reported as Loncher, though we will continue to call him Lonker for the duration. However, I will probably be using first names, except for junior and senior, who will obviously specify. That set in motion the series of events that would eventually expose the truth about the mysterious disappearances and deaths. After the death of his wife, Lonker and his 18-month-old daughter Marianne, if you don't want to do the maths, that's a year and 6 months, had left Independence, Kansas, for Iowa, but they never made it. Soon, Dr. William Henry York, Lonker's former neighbour, who had sold Lonka horses and a wagon for the trip, was alerted that the team had been found abandoned near Fort Scott, Kansas. As such, Dr. William Henry York set out looking for Lonka and Marianne in spring of 1873. He questioned homesteaders along the trail as he made his way to Fort Scott, where he identified the wagon and horses as those he had sold Lonka and the clothes found as belonging to the father and daughter. But on his way back to Independence, Dr. York made a fatal mistake. He stopped at the Bender Inn. Dr. York never returned. What the Benders didn't realise, however, was that the latest victim came from a prominent family, and this same murder would be that which starts and marks the beginning of the search and their future what was the word again? I'm terrible at this, I'm very sorry. Which would lead to them becoming incriminated. And comedic break, everyone. Also, this is going to be a long one, so remember to hydrate, grab a snack, because I know, as someone who enjoys true crime myself, that these are some of the things that make you feel the most desire for food, water, any type of comfort you can possibly find. Dr. York's prominent family was made up of two main what we will call heroes of this story. His two brothers were Colonel Ed York and Alexander M. York, a member of the Kansas State Senate. Colonel York quickly organized a search party of 75 men who searched the area for Dr. York, and in March of 73 tracked him to the Bender Inn. For the rest of this, I will be calling Colonel York just Col York, simply because it's easier and speedier, just so you're aware that it is the same guy. In this initial meeting, the Benders denied having any prior knowledge of who Dr. York was and suggested that maybe the traveller could have been met with foul play at a remote location near Drum Creek, where John Jr. claimed to have been shot at around the same time Dr. York disappeared. Without any proof they were involved in his brother's disappearance, Col York had no choice but to leave Bender Inn. Imagine this, in hindsight, knowing that you were seated at a table with your brother's murderers. You were so close, this close, to the people who had killed your family. Now that's something that gives me goosebumps. Yet Col York soon found more evidence against the Benders, and he returned on April 3rd with armed men. There Col York confronted them about a woman who claimed to have fled the Bender Inn after Elvira threatened her with knives and pistols. I guess now we're starting to see the full picture as to why she is called the She-Devil. Though Elvira initially pretended not to understand English, she began yelling about how the woman had cursed her coffee when Col York repeated the accusation. Elvira then kicked the men out, but it was too late. She'd already unmasked herself. She dropped the innocent facade and showed her mastery of the English language, as well as her true nature. Hoping to defuse the situation, Kate offered to use her psychic abilities to assist Col York in his search for his brother. She told him that if he returned that Friday night with fewer men, she would show him to Dr. York's grave. Now, had he obeyed that, you can probably guess what would have happened. Come on now. Night, dark, on a Friday, fewer men. Showing him to the grave? Showing him to the grave could also mean she'd take him there in a different manner, if you know what I mean. Around the same time, neighbouring communities began to accuse Osage of being responsible for the disappearances. To address the issue, the local township held a public meeting in the Harmony Grove schoolhouse in which the community agreed to obtain search warrants for every property between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. Colonel York, John Bender Sr., and his son John Bender Jr. were all in attendance. A few days later, a local noticed that animals on the Bender property were dead or starving. Upon investigating, elected township officer Leroy, can I say this word? D-I-C-K, found that the property had been abandoned and there was a terrible stench, a bad odour coming from a trap door nailed shut and underneath a bed. Imagine sleeping there. His subsequent call for a search party turned up hundreds of locals wielding shovels and pickaxes, ready to search the Bender Inn. It's kind of like one of those witch hunts, the image that you can think of when seeing that. Just imagine all these, quote, commoners banding together with pickaxes and shovels and just wanting to burn people alive for crimes that this time I'd say are quite justified. Honestly, I don't believe in torture and stuff like that, but some people really do deserve it. What they found was a scene of such gore that should have Sir Stephen King himself have written such fiction, even he would have been called far-fetched. Underneath the trapdoor, there was an empty room. Now, I'm going to be describing gore for people who aren't really comfortable. Please skip ahead. Just trigger warning. Where they found the smell coming from clotted blood that had soaked through the stone floor into the soil below. Not finding any bodies, the search made its way to Elvira and Kate's vegetable garden and apple orchard, where they would find Dr. York buried in a shallow grave. By the next day, at least 10 bodies had been recovered from the garden, and well, along with additional dismembered body parts. The same modus operandi. The victims were hit in the head, likely with a hammer, before having their throats slit. It was evident on all bodies except that of Marianne, the young girl who was likely buried alive. Many of the bodies also had been indecently mutilated, possibly suggesting genital trauma. They couldn't be even left alone in death. And the poor child buried alive. A helpless young, not even 2-year-old, screaming and crying for her father that had probably already been killed and was 6 feet under himself. How depraved can you be? How terrible, how monstrous can you be to place a child on the ground in a hole and slowly fill it with ground and dirt? It's such a terrible imagery. Imagine just this child crying. She can't even walk yet, probably. And she's just crying and screaming for help as dirt gets poured on top of her, into her mouth, into her eyes. And soon she can no longer breathe out of even her nose as she just suffocates. Her crying dies down and she just dies. Based on the evidence and stories told by survivors of the Bender Inn, it is believed that the guests were given the seat of honour at the dining table, which backed up against the canvas room divider and was positioned over the trap door to the cellar. Once their victim was sitting, one of the men would knock the visitor out with a hammer from behind. One of the women would then slit the victim's throat to make sure they were completely dead. The body would then be dropped through the trapdoor, stripped, and later buried or dismembered. You know what makes it even worse? The fact that it would have been so easy to kill that child. They made sure all the adults were clearly dead, but they had to bury alive the child. Why do you think that is? Any guess? I'll tell you one. As someone who's been abused, I know abusers all too well. And it's a power play. They are scared of their victims until they're helpless. The victims, once they can no longer defend themselves, they are just pawns, just objects for their entertainment. When someone can no longer fight back, they are not a threat. They weren't threatened by the girl. They knew she couldn't fight back. So that's why they enjoyed taking her out even more, compared to the adults who they knew at some point could fight back. Despicable. The body would then be dropped through the trapdoor, stripped, and later buried or dismembered. Can't remember if I already mentioned that. Yes, sorry, I did. Though some victims were wearing valuables or carrying cash, a lack of targeting of the rich or powerful suggests that the Benders simply killed for the thrill, not for money or any other reason. Around a dozen bullet holes were also found in the cabin, likely from victims who had tried to fight back. One of the few items that was found in the cabin was a Bible with notes in German who identified John Jr. as one John Gebhardt. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This, as well as reports from neighbours suggesting that John Jr. and Kate may have actually been a couple instead of brother and sister, Sweet Home Alabama. In fact, it is now believed that none of the four were actually named Bender, and that only the mother and daughter were related. Elvira is thought to have been born Almira Mark in the Adirondack Mountains, and to have had multiple children and husbands, some say who died of head injuries. Now, here the rumours begin. For example, she is rumoured to have had as many as 12 children and to actually have killed some of her husbands. But those are just rumours. Before she took the Bender alias. John Sr. was likely born John Flickinger before immigrating from either Germany or the Netherlands. Some sources also suggest Norway. However, it is less prominent and more likely that the order of likelihood goes number 1 Germany, number 2 Netherlands, and then potentially Norway. But the most likely is Germany. And Kate Bender as Elvira's 5th child, Eliza Griffith. So they had a lot of different names, but we will continue to call them, of course, the names Elvira, Kate, John and John. In the wake of the gruesome discoveries made on the Bender property, both State Senator Alexander York and Kansas Governor Thomas A. Osborne offered substantial rewards for the apprehension of said family. Detectives followed wagon tracks to find the family's horses, though those had been abandoned just 12 miles north of the inn. From there, it's hard to tell what is real and what is urban legend, so fair warning. Some say that John Jr. and Kate travelled by railroad to an outlaw colony near the border of Texas and New Mexico, where law enforcement couldn't go. One detective even claimed to have tracked John Jr. to the border and found that he died of apoplexy. Meanwhile, there were reports that Ma and Pa Bender had fled towards St. Louis, Missouri. For many years after the crimes, two women traveling together would be accused of being Kate and Elvira Bender. And though several vigilante groups would claim to have caught and killed the Benders, none provided evidence or claimed the cash reward. In year 1884, an elderly man who investigators said matched the description of Pa Bender was arrested in Idaho for a murder committed with a hammer. While waiting for more details from Kansas, the man tried to escape by severing his own foot. He ended up bleeding to death and decomposed before an identification could be made. In 1889, a mother, Almira, and daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, were arrested for larceny in Michigan and subsequently accused of being Elvira and Kate Bender. But when they were brought to Kansas, a panel from Labette County meant to confirm their identity provided inconsistent results. With significant doubt of their identity as the Benders, the women were released and sent back to Michigan. But while the Benders themselves were likely never held accountable for the murders committed in Labette County, others certainly were punished for their crimes. 12 men in total were charged as accessories for helping dispose of the stolen goods. This included Mick Cherry, a member of the Vigilante Committee, who, it was later revealed, forged a letter to a victim's wife that made it appear as if he'd arrived safely. Imagine this. You know that your husband's taking on a difficult journey, one that he may never come back from. So you wait anxiously for news to arrive about how his dangerous journey is proceeding, if he'd arrived safely or not, just to get a message saying, I'm okay, everything's fine, I'm alive, and then discover that it was someone complicit of his murder that had sent you that letter, and you had been, in the sixth sense, you had been happy about it to hear that he was okay, just to then discover that he actually wasn't. It would feel not only heartbreaking to know your husband had died, but you'd get like psychological damage in the sense that imagine yourself being happy about someone complicit in his murder, not unknowingly, but in hindsight, you know that the person who sent you the message wasn't your husband, yet you reacted as if it was, and I don't know, something like that would definitely cause more trauma than just, him never coming back. As the story of the Benders spread across the country in the years following the murder spree, thousands of tourists and souvenir hunters flocked to the Benders' former homestead, looting the property down to the bricks lining the cellar and stones lining the well. Hammers allegedly from the home have been displayed at Cherryville Museum, while a stained knife thought to have been taken from the Benders Inn now belongs to the Kansas Historical Society. To this day in Kansas, a traveling mother and daughter might be teased about being Ma and Kate Bender, the women, like the legend itself, immortal in their infamy. Most of all, the story of the Bloody Benders has endured because of its ability to inspire fictional accounts, including one by the famous prairie writer Laura Ingalls Wilder, who claimed that Pa Ingalls had joined a vigilante hunt and that she'd come to her own conclusion as to what he meant when he said the family would, quote, never be found, unquote, in her noted autobiography Pioneer Girl. But while there is some evidence that the Ingalls family may have encountered victim George Lonker, the Ingalls family had already left Kansas for Wisconsin by the time the Benders moved to the area, yet she's far from the only writer hoping to cash in on the crimes committed by this family. An episode of Supernatural featured a family of serial killers named the Benders, while two of the main characters in the video game Red Dead Redemption are modelled after John Jr. and Kate Bender. While the fate of the Bender family may never truly be known, the Bloody Benders live on in the legend, a real-life horror story forever ingrained into the collective memory of the Kansas plains and beyond. Now, that was a heart-wrenching story. They could make so many films about this. For example, the ghost of the Bloody Benders, the haunted Bender property. Honestly, after this, I might go on to look at some stuff of like, have people actually gone to the Bender property? Have they like ghost hunters gone there? Have treasure hunters found? What remnants of the victims were recovered? How were they treated? I also want to add in my own theories. So this part is all my own thoughts on the matter. When they said that they found the bodies, unclothed, and they like removed all the clothes, okay, the whole necrophilia part, let's just take that out of the equation for a second. Another thing they could have done is, why would they leave the clothing in such an obvious place, like the trapdoor under a bed, etc.? The clothing, why would you take the clothing off the victim, which would incriminate you? Like, at least put it back after you've done whatever sick stuff you want to do. It's, like they said, for the thrill. It's almost as if they wanted to start a chase, to be caught in a crime and start being chased. It was just them being like, in a real life thriller, they were running from authorities. And if it was true that John Jr. and Kate were in a incestuous relationship, or weren't even brother and sister, that would also be like some kind of the book top girlies would go crazy for this type of stuff. I'm trying to make jokes. It's very hard to in a case like this when you know what terrible things have transpired. And I genuinely hope this was an entertaining enough episode for you. It is sickening, absolutely, don't get me wrong. It's disgusting. And it's definitely a very weird feeling to have to recite the atrocities these people have committed. Nonetheless, I hope to see you again in the next one. I love you, my sweet berries. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, the usual YouTube stuff, and I love you. Goodbye. I hope you had as much fun as me today. Same time tomorrow. If you enjoyed, you might also like these.